It started with laughter, hers, bright and melodic, echoing through the open doorway of our backyard. I was upstairs, rummaging through a box of winter clothes in the guest room closet, when I heard it. Not her usual laugh, mind you. This one was different, less restrained, like a secret let loose. I paused mid-fold, holding a scarf in my hands, and strained to listen. There it was again, accompanied by a low murmur, someone else's voice. Curiosity piqued, I crept down the hallway and peeked out the window overlooking our backyard. Amanda was sitting on the patio, her back to me, the soft glow of string lights catching the sheen of her dark hair. She was leaning forward, her body language open, relaxed, her arm casually resting on the table. Across from her sat a man I didn't recognize. He wasn't particularly remarkable, tall, average build, wearing one of those business casual ensembles you'd see in any corporate office. But it wasn't him that caught my attention. It was her. The way she smiled at him, the way her hand fluttered as she gestured, the way her laughter spilled out effortlessly, it was the kind of behavior she hadn't shown me in months. Maybe longer. I told myself it was nothing. A work meeting that had somehow extended into dinner, or perhaps a neighbor discussing some community event. But I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. I decided to wait. The next day, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. The laughter, the leaning in, the ease of it all. Amanda left early for work that morning, like she always did, her coffee mug still warm on the counter when I walked into the kitchen. The house felt emptier than usual, and I hated the silence that let my thoughts run unchecked. It wasn't paranoia, I told myself. I was being rational. Observant. My marriage was worth understanding, even if it meant digging into things I might not want to see. By lunchtime, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront her yet. Confrontation meant excuses, arguments, or explanations that could make me doubt what I already felt was true. Instead, I decided to observe. Quietly, deliberately. That evening, Amanda came home later than usual. She walked in with the same tired smile she always wore after a long day, kissed me on the cheek, and tossed her bag on the couch. "Long meeting," she mumbled, heading toward the kitchen. Her phone buzzed on the countertop while she poured herself a glass of water. My eyes darted to it out of instinct, but I stopped myself. This wasn't about snooping, not yet. I needed something concrete, something undeniable. "Dinner's in the oven," I said, trying to sound casual. "Thanks, babe," she said over her shoulder, already heading upstairs to shower. When she was out of sight, I stepped into the kitchen and leaned against the counter, staring at her phone. It wasn't locked. The screen displayed an incoming notification, a meeting reminder. Harmless. But beneath that was another, "Dinner tomorrow?" I stepped back, forcing myself to stay calm. I had promised myself no snooping, no jumping to conclusions. But dinner tomorrow wasn't a phrase I could ignore. The following day, I decided to rearrange my schedule. Amanda thought I was heading to work as usual, but I had no intention of staying there. After dropping off a few files and ensuring my absence wouldn't raise questions, I parked my car a block from our house and waited. Amanda's car pulled out of the driveway around 10 a.m., earlier than usual. She wasn't dressed for work, jeans, a light sweater, and sunglasses instead of her usual office attire. My stomach tightened as I started my car and followed at a distance, my heart pounding louder with every turn. She drove to a cafe on the other side of town, one we'd never been to together. It was small and tucked away, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. She parked and walked inside, glancing over her shoulder once as though she were expecting someone. I stayed in my car, parked across the street, watching as she settled into a corner booth. A few minutes later, the same man from last night walked in. He wasn't wearing business attire today, just jeans and a t-shirt. He smiled when he saw her, and they greeted each other like old friends. But it wasn't friendly, was it? The way his hand lingered on her back as he sat down, the way she leaned in to whisper something that made him laugh. For 45 minutes, I watched. Watched her laugh, watched him gesture animatedly, watched her reach across the table to touch his hand briefly before pulling back. It was more than I wanted to see, but not enough to satisfy the questions buzzing in my head. When they left, I waited a few minutes before following them. They walked down the street together, their shoulders brushing, talking like they didn't have a care in the world. I stayed far enough back to remain unnoticed, blending in with the lunchtime crowd. They stopped outside a small boutique hotel. I froze, my breath catching as he held the door open for her. She hesitated, glancing around briefly before stepping inside. He followed. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the spot as I stared at the door they'd just walked through. Every logical part of me wanted to turn around and go home, pretend I hadn't seen any of it. But another part, the part that had been simmering since last night, told me to follow. Inside the hotel lobby, I spotted them at the reception desk. Amanda was signing something, probably a room key. She handed it back to the receptionist, and they headed toward the elevator. I didn't follow them. I didn't need to. Instead, I walked back to my car, my mind racing with anger, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name. That night, I didn't say anything. Amanda came home at her usual time, acting as though nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, asked how my day was, and sat down to eat the dinner I'd made. I watched her closely, searching for any sign of guilt or hesitation, but she was as composed as ever. If anything, she seemed more relaxed than she had been in weeks. I went to bed early, unable to sit across from her any longer. Lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I replayed everything I'd seen that day. The cafe, the hotel, the way she touched his hand. I knew what I had to do. The next step wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. I needed proof. Proof that even Amanda couldn't deny. The next morning, Amanda left the house like clockwork. She kissed me goodbye, grabbed her bag, and headed out the door. I followed her movements carefully, staying casual, as if nothing had changed since yesterday. But everything had changed. I didn't go to work. I didn't trust myself to sit in an office, pretending life was normal. Instead, I stayed home and focused on what I needed to do next. By midday, I decided I wasn't going to let another day pass without confronting her. I didn't have all the proof I wanted, but I had enough to demand answers. The image of Amanda walking into that hotel with him was burned into my memory. If she denied it, I wasn't going to let her slip away without consequences. That evening, Amanda came home at her usual time. She looked tired, maybe a little preoccupied, but nothing out of the ordinary. I had dinner ready, as I always did. It was a routine I'd kept for years, but tonight felt different. "Hey," she said, setting her bag down by the door. "Smells good. What's for dinner?" "Chicken and rice," I said, keeping my tone neutral. She sat down at the table, pulling her phone out to check something while I brought the plates over. I sat across from her, watching as she scrolled through whatever was on her screen. "How was work?" I asked. She didn't look up. "Fine. Busy as usual." I waited a moment, letting the silence stretch before I spoke again. "You know, I saw something interesting today." That got her attention. She glanced up, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" I leaned back in my chair, studying her expression. I had some time on my hands, so I decided to take a drive. Ended up across town. Her face didn't change, but I saw the flicker of something in her eyes, hesitation, maybe. "Oh," she said, her voice carefully even. "Anything interesting over there?" I nodded. "Actually, yeah. There's this little cafe I've never seen before. Cozy place, nice atmosphere." She smiled faintly. "Sounds nice." "And then there was the boutique hotel a few blocks away," I continued, my tone sharpening. "Caught my attention too." That did it. The faint smile disappeared, replaced by a tightness around her mouth. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice quieter now. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "Because I saw you, Amanda. At the cafe. At the hotel. With him." Her face froze, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it outright. But then she looked away, her jaw tightening. "You were following me?" she asked, her voice edged with anger. You're damn right I was, I said, keeping my voice steady. What did you expect me to do, Amanda? Sit back and ignore the fact that you're sneaking off with some guy while I'm here keeping our life together? It's not what you think, she said quickly, standing up and moving to the other side of the room. Oh, really? I stood as well, following her. Then why don't you tell me what it is? Explain it to me, Amanda, because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what I think. She turned to face me, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and panic. He's just a friend, she said. A friend you meet in cafes and take to hotels? I shot back. Do you think I'm stupid? It wasn't like that, she said, her voice rising. We were meeting for work. He's a client. I laughed bitterly. A client? You expect me to believe that? Do you take all your clients to hotels in the middle of the day? Her face reddened, and she crossed her arms defensively. I don't have to explain myself to you. Yes, you do. I shouted. You owe me an explanation, Amanda. After everything we've been through, after everything I've done for this marriage, you owe me the truth. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. Fine, she said finally, her voice trembling. You want the truth? We've been seeing each other for a few months. It's not serious. It's nothing. Nothing? I repeated, my voice low and dangerous. You call sneaking around behind my back nothing? You've been lying to me, Amanda. Every single day, you've been lying. She didn't respond. Her silence was answer enough. The rest of the conversation was a blur of accusations, denials, and half-hearted apologies. She tried to justify it, saying she felt neglected, that our marriage had grown stale, that she needed something to make her feel alive again. I didn't buy it. You should have come to me, I said, my voice cold. If you were unhappy, if you felt something was missing, you should have talked to me. But instead, you decided to destroy everything we built by sneaking around with some guy you barely know. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, tears streaming down her face. I don't care what you meant, I snapped. What matters is what you did. And now you have to live with the consequences. She didn't argue after that. She just sat there, crying softly while I gathered my thoughts. The confrontation had ended, but the fallout was just beginning. After the confrontation, Amanda slept in the guest room. Or at least, that's where she was when I finally managed to fall asleep around 3 in the morning. My mind wouldn't stop racing. The anger, the humiliation, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal churned in my chest like a storm I couldn't control. But beneath all of that was a cold, calculating clarity. I needed a plan. By sunrise, I knew exactly what I had to do. I wasn't interested in petty revenge. Smashing her belongings or shouting in public might have felt good in the moment, but it wouldn't fix anything. No, I wanted her to feel the weight of her choices. I wanted her to see what she'd risked and lost, and I wanted her to regret it so deeply that she couldn't look at herself in the mirror. The first step was to gather evidence. I'd already seen enough to know what was going on, but I needed something concrete, something undeniable. If this was going to end in divorce, I wanted to be in control. That morning, while Amanda was still asleep, I called in sick to work. Then, I set about my plan. First, I went through our shared files on the home computer. She wasn't particularly tech-savvy, which made it easy to find what I was looking for. Her email account was still logged in, and it didn't take long to find messages between her and the man from the hotel. His name was Greg, and their correspondence left little to the imagination. The emails weren't limited to logistics about when and where to meet. There were jokes, flirtations, and even plans for a weekend getaway, a getaway she had conveniently described to me as a work conference. Screenshots were my first line of defense. I copied everything, emails, attachments, even calendar invites, and saved them to an encrypted USB drive. Next, I set up a few well-placed cameras around the house. Nothing too invasive, just enough to capture anything that might prove useful later. One in the living room, one in the kitchen, and another in the hallway near the guest room. I wasn't entirely sure what I expected to find, but I wasn't leaving anything to chance. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Amanda kept to herself, barely speaking to me unless it was absolutely necessary. She spent most of her time in the guest room or out of the house, and when she was home, the tension was suffocating. But I wasn't done yet. I reached out to a private investigator, a recommendation from a friend who had gone through something similar. The investigator was discreet and professional, and within a few days, he had a full report on Greg. Greg was married. That detail alone opened up a world of possibilities. I now had leverage not just over Amanda, but over him too. The report included his address, workplace, and even photos of him and Amanda together. The most important part of my plan was timing. I didn't want to confront her again until I had everything in place. I needed her to think I was still reeling, still too hurt to act. That's when people get sloppy, when they think they've won. It took 2 weeks to gather everything I needed. In that time, I played the role of the broken husband. I kept my distance, avoided confrontation, and let her think I was quietly accepting my new reality. But behind the scenes, I was preparing for the final blow. One Friday evening, I asked Amanda to sit down for dinner. It was the first time I'd made an effort to bridge the gap since our confrontation, and I could see the surprise in her eyes. "What's this about?" she asked cautiously, sitting across from me at the table. "I've been thinking," I said, keeping my voice calm. "About us. About what happens next." She nodded, looking wary but hopeful. "And? I want to move forward," I said. "But we need to be honest with each other. Completely honest." Her expression faltered for a moment, but she recovered quickly. "I've already told you everything." "Have you?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," she said firmly. I smiled, a small, tight smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Then you won't mind watching this." I pulled out my laptop and played the footage from the cameras I'd set up. Nothing incriminating, just enough to show her coming and going, sneaking out at odd hours, lying about where she was going. Her face drained of color as she watched. "This is just the beginning," I said, closing the laptop. "I have emails, texts, photos, enough to prove exactly what you've been doing. Enough to take to a divorce lawyer, and enough to ensure Greg's wife knows exactly who her husband has been spending his time with." Her eyes widened. "You wouldn't." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "Don't tell me what I would or wouldn't do. You made this choice, Amanda. Now, you have to live with the consequences." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared at the table, her hands clenched into fists. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" "I want you out of this house," I said without hesitation. "I want you to pack your things and leave. You can go to Greg, or you can find somewhere else to stay, but you're not staying here." "And if I don't?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Then I go public," I said simply. "I send everything I have to Greg's wife, to your family, to anyone who needs to know what kind of person you really are." The threat hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. Amanda didn't argue. She didn't beg or plead. She simply nodded, tears streaming down her face as she stood and left the room. By the next day, she was gone. For the first few days after Amanda left, the house was eerily silent. The absence of her voice, her footsteps, her presence, it was deafening in its own way. I wasn't sad, though. I wasn't mourning the loss of what we had, because by now, it was painfully clear that what we had was already gone long before I caught her with Greg. But as much as I tried to focus on moving forward, there were practical matters that had to be addressed. She hadn't contacted me, not even to pick up the rest of her things. It was as though she were avoiding me entirely, waiting for me to make the next move. I wasn't going to let her get off that easily. I decided to call her on a Sunday morning. It was deliberate. I knew she'd be home, and I didn't want to give her any excuse to avoid the conversation. She picked up on the third ring. "Hello?" "It's me," I said. There was a pause. "What do you want?" Her tone was defensive, guarded. We need to talk, I said. Face to face. There are things we need to settle, and I'm not going to do it over the phone. Another pause. I could hear her breathing, the hesitation in her silence. Fine, she said finally. When? Today, I replied. Come by the house at noon. I'll make sure I'm the only one here. All right, she said. I'll be there. At exactly noon, her car pulled into the driveway. I watched from the living room window as she stepped out, her movements hesitant. She looked different, more subdued, like someone trying to blend into the background. When she walked through the front door, she barely looked at me. Instead, she glanced around the house, as though expecting something to have changed. Let's sit, I said, gesturing to the dining table. She followed me wordlessly, sitting across from me just as she had the night I confronted her. But this time, the air between us was heavier, loaded with unspoken tension. I'm not here to rehash what you've done, I began, leaning forward slightly. That's already been established. But we need to talk about what happens next. She nodded slowly, folding her hands in her lap. Okay. I've spoken to a lawyer, I said bluntly. I'm filing for divorce. Her eyes flickered, but she didn't seem surprised. I figured as much. I'm not interested in dragging this out, I continued. I want this to be as clean and straightforward as possible. I've already made arrangements for how the assets will be divided, and I want to make sure we agree on everything before this goes to court. Amanda's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. And what about the house? I'm keeping it, I said firmly. You walked away from this marriage, Amanda. You don't get to walk back in and claim a stake in the life you chose to destroy. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might push back. But then she nodded. Fine. Good, I said, pulling out a folder from the chair next to me. These are the preliminary documents. My lawyer has already looked them over, and I suggest you do the same. Once you're ready to sign, we can move forward. She stared at the folder for a long moment before taking it from me. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed it in her lap. I never wanted it to end like this, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I let out a bitter laugh. What did you think would happen, Amanda? Did you think you could keep sneaking around with Greg and I'd never find out? Or worse, that I'd find out and just forgive you? She looked down, avoiding my gaze. I don't know what I thought. That's the problem, I said coldly. You didn't think. You acted selfishly, and now we're here. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, filled with a mixture of guilt and defiance. It wasn't just about me, she said. I felt like we were drifting apart, like we weren't connecting anymore. So you cheated? I shot back. Instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix whatever was wrong, you decided to destroy everything we built. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel any sympathy. I made a mistake, she said, her voice cracking. A terrible mistake. But I never stopped loving you. I shook my head. Don't, I said sharply. Don't sit there and tell me you love me. You don't do this to someone you love. For a while, neither of us spoke. The room was silent except for the occasional sound of a car passing by outside. Finally, Amanda broke the silence. Is there any way we can fix this? She asked, her voice barely audible. I stared at her, my anger momentarily giving way to something deeper, something closer to pity. No, I said simply. You made sure of that. She nodded, her shoulders slumping as though a weight had finally settled on her. I'm sorry, she whispered. Sorry doesn't fix this, I said. It doesn't undo the damage. All it does is make you feel better about what you've done. But it doesn't change anything for me. She wiped her eyes, taking a deep breath. I understand. After that, the conversation shifted to logistics. We discussed how we'd handle the remaining bills, the division of assets, and the timeline for finalizing the divorce. It was clinical, almost businesslike, but it was necessary. By the time she left, the air between us felt hollow. There was no closure, no catharsis, just the grim reality of a marriage that was now nothing more than paperwork. As her car disappeared down the street, I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. The hard part was over, but the journey ahead was still uncertain. Once Amanda's car turned the corner and vanished from sight, I closed the door and stood there for a moment, staring at the empty hallway. It was done. Not entirely, not yet, but the worst of it was behind me. There would be legal proceedings, signatures, and splitting of assets in the weeks to come, but the emotional separation was complete. The silence in the house wasn't just physical now, it was something heavier, something I'd have to live with for a while. But I wasn't afraid of it anymore. That evening, I took a seat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the files, notes, and legal documents I'd amassed over the past month. It was a strange sight, my marriage condensed into a few pieces of paper. Bank statements, the division of property, and, tucked neatly in the corner of the stack, a printout of the emails I'd discovered between Amanda and Greg. I could have thrown them away. There was no longer any use for them. But I kept them, at least for now. Not because I wanted to dwell on what had happened, but because they were a reminder of what ignoring the signs had cost me. The first night alone in the house was harder than I expected. Not because I missed Amanda, but because it felt like every object in the house was taunting me. The couch where we'd watch TV, the dining table where we'd shared meals, the framed photos on the walls, all of them seemed to mock the life I thought we had. I went room by room, taking down photos of us together. I left the ones with family and friends, but anything that showed just the two of us went into a box in the garage. It was part of the cleansing process, I supposed. A way to reclaim the space as my own. By the time I finished, it was late. I sat on the edge of the bed, my bed now, and stared at the spot where Amanda used to sleep. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight of everything settle on me. I wasn't angry anymore. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind a deep, gnawing sadness. It wasn't just about what Amanda had done. It was about the realization that the life I'd worked so hard to build was gone. Not because of one moment, but because of a series of choices, hers and mine, that had led us here. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the house forever. It was a Saturday, and I didn't have anywhere I needed to be, but I couldn't sit there surrounded by the echoes of what once was. I grabbed my car keys and drove without a destination in mind. I ended up at a park a few miles away, a place Amanda and I had taken walks together when we first moved into the neighborhood. I hadn't been there in years, but something about it felt fitting. I found a bench near the pond and sat there, watching families and couples stroll by. It was strange, seeing them so happy, so unaware of how fragile their lives might be. A man about my age sat down on the bench next to me. He was dressed casually, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He glanced at me and nodded. "Nice day," he said. "Yeah," I replied, not really in the mood for conversation but not rude enough to ignore him. "Here alone?" he asked after a moment. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Just clearing my head." He chuckled softly. "I know the feeling." We sat in silence for a while, watching the ducks paddle across the pond. "Marriage trouble?" he asked suddenly, catching me off guard. I turned to look at him, wondering if I was that obvious. "I'm a divorce lawyer," he explained with a shrug. "I can spot it a mile away." I laughed despite myself. "Yeah, something like that." He nodded knowingly. "It's rough, but it gets easier. First, it feels like the end of the world. Then, one day, it doesn't." "Is that what you tell your clients?" I asked. "Pretty much," he said with a grin. "And most of the time, it's true." By the time I left the park, I felt lighter somehow. The conversation with the stranger had been brief, but it reminded me that I wasn't alone in this. People went through this all the time, and they came out the other side. When I got home, I started making a list. It wasn't anything fancy, just a piece of scrap paper and a pen. At the top, I wrote, "What comes next?" The first item on the list was simple: call a contractor. The house needed to feel like mine again, and I decided the best way to do that was to make some changes. The second item was harder: talk to someone. A therapist, maybe. A friend. I didn't know yet, but I knew I couldn't keep all of this bottled up. The third item was the one that surprised me the most: try something new. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I was determined to figure it out. Over the next few weeks, I started crossing items off the list. The house began to transform, little by little. I repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and got rid of anything that felt tied to the past. I also started therapy. It wasn't easy, talking about everything that had happened, but it was necessary. For the first time in years, I felt like I was truly facing my emotions instead of burying them. And I did try something new. I joined a cooking class on a whim, something Amanda had always suggested but I'd never had the time for. It was awkward at first, but I found that I enjoyed it. Months later, the divorce was finalized. Amanda and I didn't speak much during the process, and when we did, it was polite but distant. By the end, I felt more relieved than anything. Looking back, I realized I'd spent so much of my marriage focused on keeping things together that I hadn't stopped to think about what I really wanted. Amanda's betrayal had shattered my life, but it also forced me to rebuild it. And in that rebuilding, I found something unexpected: myself. As I sat on my newly refurbished couch, a glass of wine in hand, I thought about the future. It wasn't clear yet, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was mine. And that was enough.